150 years old, and it's a little bit hard for me to entirely comprehend it. I thought that as a part of this convocation address, I'll talk a little bit about the work we have done and in particular how that's impacted economics. So if you want a title, I want to talk about the experimental approach to economics. How has it changed the subject? The starting point of, I think, a lot of the sort of the approach that we've taken and for which we won the prize came from a very simple point, which is that we're actually, even though we are often wise and often able to see things that, you know, have deep insights, it's also the case that we're often wrong, that our intuitions about the world are often false. I learned this very much the hard way. When I first started doing experiments in mid-90s, 1996 exactly, I was working with an NGO in Rajasthan called Seva Mandir, a wonderful NGO. I've collaborated with it since, and it's one of the one of the great learning experiences of my life to have been working with it. We were discussing what's a policy issue that they were interested in, because the whole point of an RCT is to eventually answer something that's useful, and we wanted to start, because this was the first RCT, to my knowledge, that was being done in India. We were very much interested in demonstrating that we could have policy relevance, that we could actually answer a useful question. And while I think in some sense we did answer a useful question, we just didn't know the way it would go. So it was. So we started discussing what would be the subject of the RCT, the randomized control trial. And just to explain, a randomized control trial is the kind of the social science equivalent of a medical trial, where you, instead of sort of when you want to answer a question, what is the impact of a particular intervention, what do quite simply is randomly choose the people who get the intervention and the people who don't. And the reason to do that is to make sure that those two groups are indisputably comparable, that there's no systematic difference between them, and therefore when one of them sort of surges ahead and the other doesn't, we would be relatively reliably concluding that the effect of the intervention is what we are observing. That's what a randomized control trial is, the one we wanted to do. We wanted to answer a policy question of interest to Seva Mandir, and they said, well, we're thinking, we have these one-teacher schools. It's an NGO that runs lots of one-teacher schools in these villages in Udaipur district, and they said, well, we're thinking of adding a second teacher. And then, do you think this is worth doing a randomized control trial of? And there was some discussion. Basically, the view was, of course it's going to work, of course it's going to be great. The question is how great? Can we demonstrate the value of having an extra teacher? That was our starting point. We were all of us, they who had been lots of expertise in the field of education, me who came from, I was maybe naive then, but I had been educated in the economics of education. All of us were convinced that if you cut the teacher-student ratio by 50%, you must get a benefit. So we did a randomized control trial. We took 20 schools where there was an additional teacher and 20 schools where there was none, and we waited for a while, then we went and tested the children. It was very, I remember the moment we looked at the data, it was very sort of disturbing. There didn't seem to be any difference. So we decided that this can't be right. So maybe we're not measuring the right thing. So the next, I think, a year, we spent measuring, finding measure after measure of what was happening in the classroom. Is the classroom conducted differently? Is the teacher doing something different? Are the students learning something different? And when you are sort of optimistic and you think you'll find something, it's easy to invent things to look for. And we kept inventing things to look for. till at some point it became amply clear there was nothing. It really, you added a second teacher to the school, and despite what all of our intuitions told us, nothing happened. And that, of course, for me started a process of unlearning lots of things I had learned. Took me, sadly, 15 years to, I think, properly unlearn it, but I think eventually we learned what the answer is, and maybe towards the end I'll come back to why this happened, but I'm going to take a slightly circuitous part there. So it was what was really, I think, the most useful thing that came out of this, and indeed it came out of my friend and colleague Michael Kramer's work in Kenya, which was also around 1994. He did a randomized control trial in Kenya where he gave the children free textbooks. And again, it was obvious that this will help them learn, and of course, it didn't. And so we were sort of, there were people asking us, well, does that mean randomized control trials always fail? And the answer was, at that point we didn't know, since we hadn't done too many, but we were hoping not. And kept looking for sort of what could have gone wrong. And I think Michael was even more of an optimist than me, so he kept trying to do the same trial over and over again at larger and larger scale. And it came back over and over again that it didn't have an effect, the textbook didn't have an effect. And I think what was very, very important of that experience was that it made us realize how little we know. And I think that's the starting point of randomized controlled trials, is a certain sense of humility. That, we have very powerful narratives about the world. Some of those narratives we live by, and nonetheless, many of those narratives just don't happen to be true. And there's really a number of different reasons why they're not true. And one of them is simply, we're often trapped by the stories we build. So I'll give you an example. Economics, a different example. I'll come back to the example of education in a bit. This was an example from health, and one almost again obvious proposition in economics is that if you give people things for free, they'll take it, and they will then not value it, because of course they got it, they'll take it if you give it to them free, but they will then, of course, they didn't pay for it, they didn't really want it, you just gave it away, they took it. So it follows almost from the axioms of economics that this would be something they're going to waste. This is not just an idle thought, it's something that fundamentally informs policy. So the policies that but in particular that I'm talking about were the policies of pricing of health. So, for example, of insecticide-treated bed nets. They're known for many years that insecticide-treated bed nets are a wonderful way to save children from getting malaria. And in Africa, malaria is the single biggest killer second biggest killer of children under 5. So it's a very big deal. The bed nets will prevent that from happening if they were used appropriately. And then the debate was, should we make the bed nets free because a lot of people are poor and they don't buy bed nets, or not? And the kind of the economist answer, which kind of came out of the logic I was describing before, is of course don't give it free. If you give it free, lots of people will take it, but they won't use it. In particular, it's very important that they have some stake in this thing that you're giving them, and to make sure they have a stake in it, sell it. So Jessica Cohen was one of our students, and Pascaline Dupa, who was also kind of one of our students, did an experiment in Kenya where they decided that, well, fine, this seems obvious, but as usual, maybe now that we've learned the message that the obvious is often wrong, let's try it. So what they did was they randomly offered different people an option to buy this bed net at different prices. So some of them got it at full price, some of them got it at zero, some of it got it at 10%. And then they looked at what happens to demand, and indeed, as predicted by the economic model, people who lower price were more likely to buy it. In fact, it's at zero price, most of them bought it. As soon as you raise the price even to 10 or 20% of the market price, most people stop buying it. So that was for point number one. And you could read that to say, look, people don't want it. Since they don't want it, they won't use it. There's no point in giving it away. But they actually took the precaution of asking, not just accepting that as the answer, but going and checking what was happening to the children. And it was a bit intrusive because, you find out you need to know actually how the children are sleeping. So they would actually send surveyors to people's homes with apologies to check on how the children are sleeping. Turned out that despite all the economics that had gone before, usage of the bed nets had nothing to do with the price. So people who got it free used it 60% of the time, and people who got paid full price for it used it 60% of the time. There was no relationship whatsoever. It was not the case that people who got it free didn't use it. It was exactly flat. There was no relationship. Now, what we learned from that is that somehow this whole policy narrative built around the fact that you should price everything because pricing makes people value it was actually kind of built on a set of assumptions that didn't happen to be true. And it sort of illustrates, I think, the power of our cities. The power of our cities comes from the fact that instead of building a whole narrative on a small number of assumptions, if you care, you can just go and see if it's true. And in this particular case, it turned out not to be true. This was extraordinarily consequential. The set of social marketing organizations that were marketing these bed nets decided to take this lesson seriously, and as a result, they actually changed their mind on pricing and supported free distribution of bed nets. There was a global coalition that was built to fund that, and over the last 10 years, the number of children who die from malaria has been cut by 50%. So that's a very big deal. 5 million lives saved every year. That's an enormously consequential outcome. It's something that we should all be grateful for, and it's something that I think really wouldn't have happened without someone having the gumption to actually ask this question. So I think it's very powerful to ask the question, yes, it seems obvious, but is it true? And I think that's sort of the basic driver of this agenda of randomized controlled trials. So, as I said, one reason we don't do it is that we have a theory, and the theory tells us an answer, and we believe that answer. A second and sort of related issue is that we often have multiple theories, and those theories often paralyze us. So we were very much in the middle of that crossfire. In Udaipur district, we were working with Seva Mandir. Again, we sort of were discovered that the full immunization rate in Udaipur district, what does full immunization mean? It means the fraction of children who had all 5 shots that they're supposed to get. So this is sort of what's defined as the full immunization rate. That was 2%. 2% is extraordinarily low. It's among the world's lowest anywhere. And once we collected the data, everybody had a view of what was the problem, and all of them pointed to fingers at somebody else. So there was the view from the government. It was very clear. These people, they are backward people, and because they're backward people, they don't want to be immunized. They believe in Jharkhand, they believe in this, that they had all kinds of elaborate theories of what they believed in. But we are not responsible, they are. The NGO view which Sevamandi to some extent shared, was the opposite, which is that the government is responsible. The government does, the nurses are always absent, and therefore you can't get immunized, and because you can't get immunized, you don't get immunized. So it was very simple. The two theories, both very powerfully held. One came out of a kind of an anthropological understanding of as you'll see, more possibly a false anthropological understanding of the lives of these people. Another came from very much a kind of a governance point of view, and that was, so between them, the one thing they agreed upon is that right now there's nothing to do.